Good morning and welcome to the Chatham Conservation Foundation's winter webinar series. I am so delighted today to welcome Dave Fryxell from the Dennis Conservation Land Trust. Dave is their executive director and he is going to lead us in this discussion about citizen scientists today. We will have an opportunity at the end for some questions and answers. If you do have a question during the presentation, please feel free to write it in the chat. But otherwise, we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. The webinar will be recorded, so if you want to share it with others at a later date, you'll be able to do so as well. Thank you, Dave, so much for joining us on this Saturday morning, and we're looking forward to hearing all about what you folks are doing over there.
Great. Hello, everyone. I wanted to start by thanking Lauren and her team for having me today to share some of my latest thoughts on how citizen scientists can really make a positive impact for biodiversity conservation. Here on Cape Cod, we have just a wonderful network of land trusts who collaborate with and support one another. Our primary goal as land trusts is to protect land, usually through purchase. And the mission is important for a variety of reasons: preserving scenic landscapes, protecting water quality, providing outdoor spaces for passive recreation, and much more. But for me personally, land conservation is primarily about protecting the species that call Cape Cod home. But protecting these species, protecting biodiversity, requires much more than land protection. We must also do things like monitor the species on our land, study them, and restore habitats to ensure their well-being. Today, I'll share with you some of the ways that citizen scientists, volunteers, can help protect biodiversity on Cape Cod and beyond. I'll touch on established programs led by local conservation entities and end with our own initiative, what we're calling our Community Biodiversity Initiative, with the hope that some of you may want to join the effort. When many people think of biodiversity, their minds take them to tropical rainforests or coral reefs with brightly colored, charismatic animals like corals, reef fishes, algae, and sea turtles. While much of the world's biodiversity is less colorful than it is in these places, biodiversity elsewhere is just as interesting and just as important to study and protect. My main thesis here is that we have amazing biodiversity right here at home, and more of us should be learning about it and actively working to protect it. I'll start with just one example of a fascinating group of species that too many people are still unaware of. It is a group of freshwater mussels. So I'll play this short video from YouTube. My background is in freshwater ecology, and there are just so many species found in freshwater environments, just like these mussels that are not known, but they've evolved these fascinating mechanisms to survive and reproduce. And the interesting thing here, while this video was taken from further west of us in Massachusetts, there are several species of mussels in this group that are found in Massachusetts. Most of them are imperiled, and next to nothing is known about the specific lures that these mussels have in Massachusetts that mimic fishes. And this is a common story when it comes to species everywhere. There's just so much left to be discovered, and we can all take a part in discovering it. So just to start with the boring stuff, some definitions. What exactly is biodiversity? And put simply, biodiversity is the great variety of life on planet Earth. There are different types of biodiversity, such as the different species that are present in a given location, like species diversity. There's the genetic diversity within and among those species, as well as higher levels of diversity, ecosystem diversity. So the working definition for my talk of biodiversity will simply be the set of species that can be found in a given area. So why do we care about biodiversity? Biodiversity is important for many, many reasons. Some you might describe as practical and others bordering on ethical. It is important for ecosystem stability and resilience. The idea here is that more species with similar functions in nature means there's more redundancy. So if one species becomes less abundant or goes extinct, the impact on the ecosystem is minimized because many other species perform similar roles and functions. Economic value. You just need to think of fisheries, which are the primary source of protein for so much of the world's population. Pollination and agriculture. Most of our plant foods rely on pollination to produce the fruits that we harvest and eat from them. And in some cases, plants can only be pollinated by just a few specialist pollinator species, which we must conserve. Climate regulation. Plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and help keep the planet cool. Having many plants and a lot of biodiversity means a greater number of them can thrive in a great variety of habitats, increasing the total amount of carbon that can be sequestered. And then there's cultural and aesthetic value. And cultures truly evolve around natural resources, and humans have a long history of promoting the species that are culturally important to them. As to aesthetics, for me, this borders on ethics. The raw beauty of all species, for me, is reason enough to protect them. What's more, the fact that there is so much left to be discovered of nature's biodiversity is more reason for its wholesale protection. Just imagine causing an extinction of any of these gorgeous bees on the right-hand side of the slide before we even get to observe, study, and understand them. And while cultures have evolved with nature, and many, especially indigenous cultures, have promoted biodiversity, our own modern culture has done much the opposite. One of the earliest threats to America's biodiversity after European arrival was overexploitation. In the pre-colonial and colonial eras, exploitation of America's natural resources is what led to the colony's success. Early on, the fur trade and trapping brought an abundance of wealth to America, with pelts of almost all the full fur-bearing animals being harvested and shipped back to Europe. And in many cases, unfortunately, this overexploitation led to permanent species extinctions. For example, the East Coast sea mink was an analog of the West Coast's modern-day sea otter. It went extinct due to the fur trade in the 1800s and will never come back. The great auk there in the middle was the Northern Hemisphere's analog to the Southern Hemisphere's penguins. They too were lost due to overhunting, but in this case for food. Then the heath hen on the right there was a species that held on for decades, becoming ecologically or functionally extinct long before it actually disappeared forever. Intense management efforts to support a small remnant population of heath hen on Martha's Vineyard proved to be inadequate. And the heath hen, once a staple of Massachusetts sport and diet, went extinct at last in 1932. I think it's just such a shame that we Modern inhabitants of Massachusetts will never be able to experience these species, New England's own, so to speak, sea otters, penguins, and native chickens. But luckily, hunting, fishing, trapping, and other conservation laws were put in place to protect species and habitats. Many became locally extinct, finding refuge in small areas or up north, and they have since been able to return. Species like river otters, mink, and other fur bearers that were once overexploited have returned, including what's on the screen here, the American fishers. With these species around, nature is just so much more interesting and worthy of protection. But in addition to overexploitation, which was one of the early drivers of biodiversity loss locally, species have been widely threatened by habitat loss. So on the screen here is just an aerial photograph from this very cool tool called the Cape Cod Chronology Viewer. It has georeference photographs, aerial photographs dating as far back as 1939. And you can open this tool and just cruise around to see how your area of town has changed. And in this case, what you see towards the north near Cape Cod Bay is open fields all across the north of Dennis from east to west that were used primarily for agriculture. Since that time, many of these habitats have become reforested, but for centuries, there were entire sections of Cape Cod that were completely denuded of forest and the species that depend on the forest as well. In addition, locally on the Cape, the cranberry industry, which started here in Dennis in the early 1800s, had caused widespread destruction of habitats that are lasting to this day. Cranberry industry became so important that basically any small freshwater wetland was converted into a cranberry bog. And the cranberry industry, their practices, such as sanding bogs in winter to promote the growth of cranberries, causes compaction of soil and really reduces the biodiversity that can survive in small wetlands. And that's why in the news locally and across the region, there's been an increasing push to restore these habitats. Most recently, the Harwich Conservation Trust did just an outstanding job at their Cold Brook Eco Restoration Project, where they essentially ecologically restored what was once a cranberry bog into a natural meandering stream. And they've told me recently that within just a few months after the project was completed, they started doing biodiversity surveys, and they've already seen 10 new dragonfly and damselfly species that were not previously present. But of course, ecological restoration is much more expensive and time consuming than protecting habitats in the first place. One of the other significant threats to biodiversity is pollution, first popularized and highlighted by Rachel Carson in her book, Silent Spring. She particularly focused on pollutants like DDT that was used for mosquito and insect control that bioaccumulate up food chains and were causing the devastation of particularly birds of prey. But since that time, of course, we've enacted new laws and species have been returning. So I think most prominent of these species are osprey, which were locally extinct because of the effects of DDT and other pollutants, and have since come back in great numbers. But we are still dealing today with the effects of other pollutants, such as PFAS, forever chemicals that are polluting our own drinking water and affecting wildlife, as well as nutrient pollution from septic systems that are causing harmful algal blooms, and which can even do things like kill fish. One of the newer threats or newly recognized threats to biodiversity is climate change. And one of my colleagues from my undergraduate years at UConn, Mark Urban, has been really nailing down using all the best available data just how much biodiversity we might lose under different emission scenarios. And under the highest emission scenarios here RCP 8.5, you can see that we're gearing up to lose a high proportion of global species diversity. And so in particular, climate change threatens species inhabiting places like mountaintops, because as it gets warmer, they can't climb an elevation to maintain their ecological niche, their preferred climatic conditions, as well as species that are found in island ecosystems. In addition, species that are found in pond and small wetland ecosystems, because they are essentially islands. And so I think with this threat of climate change, coupled with all the other pollutants, or with all the other threats to biodiversity, I think it's more important now than ever that we really understand the changes that are happening, and so we can begin addressing them. One of the best ways to do that is to help collect data that inform scientists and management decisions. So climate change threats, coupled with these other threats, were the rationale behind Governor Maura Healey in 2023 signing an executive order that established the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as the nation's first state to set biodiversity conservation targets. And so the state's biodiversity initiative aims to set goals as a first step to ensure our local biodiversity is preserved. But what can we do as average citizens to help with this broader effort? There's things you can do at home, of course. You can minimize your environmental footprints. You can support organizations such as the Chatham Conservation Foundation and other local environmental nonprofits and land trusts. But you can also help gather data for better informed decision-making, which here we call citizen science. What is citizen science exactly? According to the Oxford Dictionary, it is the collection and analysis of data relating to the natural world by members of the general public, typically as a part of a collaborative project with professional scientists. So what then is citizen science specifically for biodiversity conservation? What does it entail? Put simply, these citizen science efforts involve searching for particular species and then reporting them to scientists or managers. And really, there have been an explosion of tools and programs to get involved with this, aided by technologies such as cell phones and cell phone applications. One of the most popular tools that citizen scientists can use for biodiversity protection is called iNaturalist. I assume that several of you are aware of this rather, but essentially it's an app you can download on your phone when you're taking a walk in nature, and you can photograph critters and plants that you find along the way and upload it to iNaturalist. And what iNaturalist will do is give you its best guess as to which species it is, but it also logs that observation and makes it publicly available for scientists and managers such as ourselves to use and analyze. So with iNaturalist, it's a fairly passive way to be involved in citizen science for biodiversity conservation. Right, you can do it on your own. You don't need to be a part of a broader effort. And if you're lucky, those data will be used for some sort of science. And indeed, the data are being used to inform science and management. For a very recent example, this year, my colleague Owen Nichols, who works at the Center for Coastal Studies up in P-Town, looked at iNaturalist data to understand the subtropical marine fishes that have been increasingly common this far north and along the coast of New England and Massachusetts. And I would encourage you to take a look at this study, because what they were able to do is look at how far north the species are essentially moving with climate change, and understand the increase in frequency with which these species are moving north. There's another program, or several programs, led by another local organization called the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. This one in particular is their volunteer herring count program. And so you can sign up by going to their website, and essentially you'll go to your local herring run for 10 minutes every few days and just simply count the number of herring that are passing by. The state, in partnership with APCC, has developed statistical methods that allow for fairly robust estimates of the population size of herring from these volunteer herring counts. And these data are used to support herring restoration efforts. For a very local example to me, right now, Mass DOT is replacing 3 problem culverts under Route 6A in Dennis that lead into Scargo Lake, in part because of the data that these citizen scientists collected to support decreases in the observed decreases in run size. Of course, birders are some of the best and longest standing citizen scientists, and many of them are involved in these broader initiatives to just identify as many species as possible. So one program is called the Great Backyard Bird Count, run by Audubon and the Cornell Ornithology Lab, where participants are asked to count birds for as little as 15 minutes on 1 or more days of the 4-day-long event and report their sightings through an online system at birdcount.org. And anyone can take part of this program, from beginning bird watchers to experts, and you can participate from your own backyard or anywhere in the world. For another local program, in this case put on Life and Mass DOT, they've developed something called Linking Landscapes for Massachusetts Wildlife. And it is essentially a volunteer-based wildlife monitoring program aimed at improving habitat, connectivity, and reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. So in this case, if you see roadkill, you take a photo of it and upload it to their system. And that informs both better wildlife management and conservation, and helps improve public safety to reduce wildlife car collisions. So far, all the tools that I've mentioned help provide data to scientists and managers with the hope that better understanding biodiversity will lead to improved biodiversity protection. But here in Massachusetts, there are underutilized citizen science opportunities that can directly contribute to legal protection of species habitats. So unlike the other programs I mentioned, where you're contributing data that you kind of hope will be used to protect biodiversity, in Massachusetts, there are laws that really lead to direct regulatory impact when you find and report particular species. And for an unknown reason to me, there has been no concerted effort yet to capitalize on these legal tools. So in particular, what we're talking about here are species that inhabit something called vernal pools, as well as those species that are listed on the state's endangered species list. And so what citizen scientists can do is learn to identify these species, go out, look for them, take photographs or videos and other evidence of their presence and where they were found, inform mass wildlife, and then there are new regulatory maps that are created. So for example, if you find a bunch of box turtles, you report them to mass wildlife, they'll update this regulatory map called priority habitats of rare species, such that when someone wants to destroy the habitat, build a house, or otherwise disturb the habitat, they need to go to mass wildlife for a special type of permit. So in a sense, focusing in Massachusetts on these groups of species can lead to the protection of land and habitat without the expense of acquiring it. So here at the Dennis Conservation Land Trust, DCLT, we piloted our own program to focus on finding these vernal pool and state listed species in 2023. And what we did is we recruited a small group of dedicated volunteers, and we trained them to ID some of our initial target species. And they've they really took onto this initiative and are now operating kind of fully independently, unsupervised, and they'll come to us and ask questions when they need help. But really, this program, looking for vernal pool and rare species, benefits us by growing our community. We all get to learn together, and the citizen science effort both protects the species themselves and the land without the expense of acquiring it. So after a year or so of engaging locally with our own volunteers, we wondered, can we get others involved? What can we do to motivate, recruit, and perhaps guide other organizations to do the same? And so what we did is what we're doing is we're attempting to start something called the Community Biodiversity Initiative, which aims to guide and recruit citizen scientists who can capitalize on these legal tools in Massachusetts. And to do so, we've been using publicly available data sets that, as far as I can tell, are underutilized and haven't really been analyzed before, really aiming to motivate or to identify the towns, the habitats, and the species most in need of reporting to the state in order to protect habitats. So this project is led by a team at my organization, including myself, our biodiversity scientist who we funded, we were able to fund specifically through this initiative, Fernando, and then AmeriCorps members, which are just so crucial to all of our work on Cape Cod, Jen Clifford and Lisa Barstein. And the goals of our initiative are to motivate new reporting programs focused on these vernal pool and rare species, to help prioritize which species and which habitats one should look for in a given place, and which are those that are most likely to reap these new regulatory protections. And the third goal is to guide or recruit, rather, project partners who can kind of do what we did at Dennis Conservation Land Trust, recruit their own local team, supervise their local team of citizen science volunteers to find and report whichever species from the great list of them they are most interested in learning about and studying. So there on the screen is our initial group of partners, but we're very actively recruiting other environmental organizations and land trusts to become involved with the effort. So just to start here on our Community Biodiversity Initiative, I'm going to focus on vernal pool species, and then I'll transition to state-listed species. So vernal pools, what are they? So they're essentially temporary puddles, temporary ponds that are isolated from other water bodies and support certain so-called obligate species. So these are species that are only found in vernal pool habitats, that don't have defenses against things like fishes, right? Vernal pools dry on an annual basis, so they can't support fish populations locally. And importantly, unlike other wetlands, many small vernal pool habitats are not protected under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. That being said, they can be protected through the process of certification, which essentially means you go out as a volunteer, you go to a prospective pool, you look for obligate species, you'd collect evidence, and you'd submit that evidence to the state. The pool becomes certified at that point, and then it's protected under the Wetlands Protection Act. So it can't be filled in, a house can't be built on top of it, and so forth. And importantly, vernal pools are highly vulnerable habitats, in particular to development because they're not protected unless certified, but also they're vulnerable to climate change, and in particular, changes in precipitation patterns, right? Because the seasonal filling and drying of each vernal pool is really dependent on precipitation patterns. And with climate change, we expect more variable precipitation from year to year. And so if you have a few dry years, unfortunately, the species that live in them can really become locally extirpated or extinct. So what are the obligate species, right? And what is this certification, vernal pool certification process? So Mass Wildlife, the state, has developed like extensive guidance on how volunteers can get out and certify vernal pools. And all of that information is available on their website. And another great organization to look into is the Vernal Pool Association. It's based out of Massachusetts. I believe their website is vernalpool.org. And they've kind of taken initial steps to make the state's guidance more succinct. But here on Cape Cod, essentially, what you need to do to certify a vernal pool is find both biological evidence as well as physical evidence to convince the state that that the pool is functioning as vernal pool habitat. And here on Cape Cod, the three obligate species that one will look for when trying to certify a pool are wood frogs at the top there, top left, below them, spotted salamanders, and below them, fairy shrimp. All three of these species are surprisingly common. They're quite fascinating, and identifying them is critical to protecting their habitats. So essentially, what we do here at the Dennis Conservation Land Trust with our volunteers is we go out in the spring to small wetlands that may function as vernal pools, and we look for the eggs of the wood frogs and the salamander species, which are readily distinguished from one another, even by non-experts, as well as being distinguished from other amphibian species eggs, which are not considered obligate species. So either looking for egg masses or adult fairy shrimp. And fairy shrimp are they're just beautiful little critters that most people wouldn't know exist in these puddles unless you take a close look. But essentially, they're up to like 2 inches long, so they're visible to the naked eye. And all you'd have to do is go find a pool with adult fairy shrimp, gather that evidence. So in addition to finding some egg masses from these amphibians or adult fairy shrimp, you need to submit to the state physical evidence as well. So you go out to the pool, you take photos of the eggs, then you take a photo of the pool showing that it's not connected to other wetland habitats. And that's what the state wants, to be convinced that the pool should be certified. And again, once the pool is certified, it has new legal protections under the Wetlands Protection Act. So our first step in our initiative was to look at some of the publicly available data sets to see how well are we certifying vernal pools, how frequently are we certifying vernal pools, and which vernal pools might we target, prioritize for certification. So the first question we asked, again, this is using publicly available data sets that are housed at Mass Wildlife. We asked how frequently are pools being certified all across the state of Massachusetts. And what we see here on the graph, this is essentially the accumulation of certified vernal pools through time. And on the x-axis, the bottom axis there is the year. And so you can see the beginning of the line is in the late 80s. And so that's when this vernal pool certification process was first instated. And over time, it grew in popularity, right? The rate started to increase. And for some reason, in recent years, the rate has declined almost to a standstill. So there was lots and lots of vernal pool certification happening around 2005 to 2010. And since that time, the public has lost interest in this effort. And so one question to ask is that driven by the fact that most pools across the state are already certified? And the quick answer to that is no. What we did is we downloaded other data sets and created some maps to kind of rank each town across the state by how well they've protected their vernal pools through certification. We used a very simple metric and very simple data inputs, which is to simply count the number of certified vernal pools in each town and divide that by the number of potential vernal pool wetland habitats. And what we see all across the state is that towns vary enormously, even neighboring towns. If we zoom into Dennis, you can see, or if we zoom into the Cape rather, we can see, I think what most of us care about, which is our region. But you see very wide variation. So Yarmouth only has an estimated 2% of its vernal pools certified, as well as Dennis. And this is kind of the reason we started along these lines here at the Dennis Conservation Land Trust. We noticed this pattern and wanted to start a community science effort to address it. But on the other end of the ranking, Harwich has 96%, an estimated 96% of its pool certified, and Mashpee's at over 105%. So another question that I've asked several folks is, why is this the case? Why do Harwich, Mashpee, Eastham have so many of their pools certified? And the best answer I've gotten is that there were individuals who became obsessed with vernal pools, not affiliated with an organization per se, and made it their personal mission to go look for these habitats, look for the species, submit the evidence to Mass Wildlife to protect vernal pools in their town. So our initiative is an attempt to kind of institutionalize vernal pool certification, to recruit other organizations to lead the certification process. But the overall story here, looking both at the Cape and all across the state, is there are not very many dark towns, right? Meaning there aren't very many towns that are highly certified in terms of their vernal pools. And so really all across the state and here on Cape Cod, there's immense opportunity for citizen scientists to certify pools and really have a direct regulatory impact. So now just to shift gears away from vernal pool species and towards state listed species, which is another much larger set of species that can be used to affect regulations and protect land and biodiversity. So just a bit of background on the state listed species. They're protected under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act, which was an act that was enacted in 1990. And the act protects rare species and their habitats by prohibiting the take of any plant or animal species that's listed as endangered, threatened, or special concern. And currently, the list of species is constantly changing and being reevaluated, but currently there are over 453 native plant and animal species that are protected under the Act. So unlike vernal pools, where we're focused here on Cape Cod on just 3 species, there's enormous opportunity for citizen scientists and organizations to learn about these 453 other species to help protect habitat and land. So the process here with state listed species is very similar to vernal pool certification. Essentially, you as volunteers partner with an organization. They'd help you learn to identify the state listed species of interest. You go out into the field to look for them. When you find them, you document evidence of the species presence, usually just photographs or video. You'd submit that evidence to Mass Wildlife. And then importantly, just like vernal pools, there's a direct regulatory impact when you find and report these species. So in particular, with state listed species, the state Mass Wildlife publishes something called priority habitats of rare species. That's the screenshot on the right. And anyone can check out these priority habitats by going to a tool called Mass Mapper and turning this data layer on. If anyone in this talk today in the audience today is interested in learning more about any of this stuff, I am more than eager to chat with you about it. But in essence, what you're seeing here on this Mass Mapper tool in yellow, the yellow outline, is an entire area of town that is protected as priority habitat. And so at some point, a citizen scientist or a scientist found a specific state listed species in this area, submitted evidence to the state, then the state updated this this map. And what this map does is it tells the local planning board, the local conservation commission, and so forth, when there's proposed disturbance in this area on this priority habitat, the person or entity proposing the disturbance not only has to get local permits, but they have to submit a permit application to Mass Wildlife. So really, it's adding layers of protection to land to ensure that biodiversity and these species habitats are protected. So once again, what we're trying to do here is motivate and help guide others in the search for state-listed species for these regulatory benefits. And so this is all still a work in progress here at the Dennis Conservation Land Trust, but we were able to download other data sets from the state just to look at general trends across Massachusetts and the Cape. And plotted here is simply the richness or the number of unique state-listed species in each town that have been reported to Mass Wildlife across all of history. And kind of what you immediately see is there's some variation, not quite as much variation in the number of species that have been reported across the state. And in particular, there are places colored darker that are diversity hotspots. They have more species that have been reported to Mass Wildlife. Those are places like southeastern Mass, where we are. Of course, the islands below the Cape, as well as the Connecticut River Valley and the Berkshires. If we zoom into Cape Cod and rank them, we can see that some towns have many more species than others. At the high end are Sandwich and Falmouth, with around 60 species that have been reported. And then moving down rather, Cape Dennis has just 30 species and Orleans has 22 species that have been reported. But if we look across the entire Cape, there have been 137 different current state-listed species that have ever been reported to Mass Wildlife. And so what this suggests to me, doesn't prove it per se, but what it suggests to me is that most towns have more species that can be reported. And when those species are reported, right, we'll protect more of their habitat. So in addition to kind of ranking communities by how well they've used vernal pool certification as a tool and rare species reporting as a tool, we're really trying to provide guidance for partners on which species they can target. And again, there are well over 400 state-listed species, and on the Cape, over 130 state-listed species that we'd expect to be found here. So almost an overwhelming amount of species for an organization or volunteers just looking to get started. So thinking through which species might we target here on the Cape or in a particular town. And of course, we want to target those whose natural ranges overlap with your town, as well as those that are readily identified by non-experts, right? Many species, not most of them even, but many species on the endangered species list in Massachusetts require really technical expertise. They may require harvesting parts of, say, a plant to inspect under a microscope. So we want to kind of ignore those species for the time being, because we're trying to motivate volunteers, non-experts, to get involved with this. And then lastly, we don't want to target species that would require take or disturbance or harvest in order to identify them. So we're currently working on this, but some of the species that are most popular historically here on the Cape are the eastern box turtle, right? I think some of you in the audience may be aware that when you find a box turtle, you should report it to someone. And really the reason is exactly what we're talking about, that those reports protect habitat under Massachusetts law. But box turtles are just one of over 100 species on Cape Cod, and we should be doing this for many more of them, such as this flower up here. It's a Plymouth rose gentian. It's common along pond shores. And here in Dennis, we found this species, this fish species shown on the right recently, which is called the bridal shiner. It's a species of special concern. We found it in a habitat that had never been reported before. So we're hopeful once the state reviews that observation that they'll update their priority habitat maps to better protect that particular pond. So while we're still working on getting an idea of which species we might target out in the field, we're also analyzing additional data sets to see generally which types of habitats might have the greatest opportunity for finding rare species. And just as a quick example, what we did is we compared those priority habitats to the habitat type. So whether it's upland, so dry land versus wetlands. And what we found was that wetlands make up 14% of the land area across the entire state, but they make up 32% of priority habitat area. So put differently, wetlands are overrepresented as priority habitats, and therefore we as citizen scientists might bias our efforts towards wetlands to have the greatest shot at protecting new habitat. And so this is just the first step, again, of this type of analysis. And in the future, pretty soon here, we should be able to really hone this down to different types of uplands, say like grassland versus pitch pine forests versus oak forests, and understand which of those habitats we should be targeting to find these rare species. The last piece of guidance that we're creating, so this is less data driven and more of a research exercise, is creating a guide to the rare species of Cape Cod. Again, focused on those species that are readily identified by citizen scientists and non-experts. And up there on the screen are just two of the pages we've drafted to date. Shout out to our AmeriCorps Cape Cod member, Jen Clifford. She was with us last year. She was the one who developed this template, which I think is just beautiful. And what we're hoping to do, in addition to recruiting citizen scientists to do field work and look for these species, we'd love to have help across the Cape with drafting pages. So for example, if you really like small fishes, you could help draft the bridal shiner page that's shown here. And then the idea is that volunteer groups can take this into the field and hone it through time. So like what was helpful, what was unhelpful, what appeared to be inaccurate, and so forth. So taking a step back, this is kind of a conceptual diagram of our initiative right here at the Dennis Conservation Land Trust. There in the top right on the left-hand side of this slideshow. We're doing some data analyses to help guide other local environmental organizations, including municipalities, in the creation of their own citizen science and reporting programs. So the idea is we provide guidance and recruit local environmental organizations. They recruit their own volunteers and decide which species to target using our guidance, etc. Those citizen or community scientist volunteers then do the field work. They share the evidence with their local environmental organization, who then reviews that evidence and submits it to Mass Wildlife. What we're asking of prospective partners, partner organizations, is minimal. And we're doing this initially just to recruit as many partner entities as possible. The partner pledge, so to speak, is a simple commitment to submitting 3 observations to Mass Wildlife each year, whether they be 3 vernal pool certification or 3 rare species observations. We'll provide some training with the hope that they follow best practices for field work. So things like avoiding trampling vegetation in sensitive habitats, obtaining landowner permission before entering private property, and some guidance on permits. And lastly, because the the location of rare species is sensitive, right? We don't want to make rare species locations publicly available due to concerns about the illegal wildlife trade and poaching and so forth. We're asking our partners to keep, our partner organizations and their volunteers to keep their observations confidential and internal to their organization, with one exception. That is mass wildlife, right? You need to report these observations to mass wildlife, but I don't want to know where you found specific species. And I won't tell you where we found specific state listed species. So just to wrap up here, really short conclusion slide. Biodiversity is imperiled globally, but it is also imperiled locally. And there's still so much left to be discovered right in our backyards. And you can help by joining local or any of these local organizations, citizen science programs. And I would encourage you, I touched on just a few of them in this talk. I would encourage you to Google your favorite local environmental organization to see what citizen science programs for biodiversity conservation they already have going. I mentioned APCC's Herring Run program, Mass DOT's program, but there are many, many others. Here at the Dennis Conservation Land Trust, our own community biodiversity initiative is aiming to recruit other local organizations to locate and report species, with an added benefit that these reports have a direct regulatory impact for habitat protection. In a sense, protecting land without the expense of acquiring it. And so I hope some of you are already involved with citizen science programs or would like to be involved. And again, just encourage you to contact me if you have questions, or to contact your local environmental organization to express your interest in helping with this sort of effort. With that, I'll just put some acknowledgements up on the screen, and I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you so very much, Dave. This has been so wonderful. And for those of you who have joined us and are here in Chatham, we fully plan on joining in this endeavor. So we're really excited about all the work that Dave and his team have put into this project. If you have any questions, unmute yourself and shout away. Dan Young from Chatham asked, is the vernal pool near the Chatham Airport certified? And indeed, yes, it is. We have about 5 or 6 here in Chatham, not that many that are certified. And it's one of those things, Julie's been working on some projects and teaching people how to use Mass Mapper, Dan. So if you're interested in learning, we'll put together a workshop. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Hear me.
All right, we can't hear you, so maybe try unmuting.
Or try the chat, right?
Here we go.
Try the chat. In the chat, we have, how can private landowners support priority habitats, and can they opt in to allow their land to be surveyed? Great question.
Absolutely, they can. So that's the tricky bit here. What we started doing here in Dennis is looking for rare species on the lands that we own, the lands that we already preserve, the lands that are already protected, either by ourselves, by the town, or the water district. But really the goal, if you play this out, once you have a great team of volunteers, would be to begin educating private landowners, contacting them, expressing the importance of protecting their habitat through this tool. And so that we haven't done much of yet, but it's certainly the end game for this initiative.
If you have a question and can't seem to unmute, just put it in the chat. So if private owners won't give permission, but vernal pool can be sampled off the property, would you do it?
I absolutely would. I think you do need to be extremely careful, right? We do not want to enter private property without permission. I would never certify a vernal pool on private property without permission. But it is my opinion that if a vernal pool has the obligate species, it deserves to be certified. It deserves to be protected as every other wetland is protected under the Wetlands Protection Act. And so here in Dennis, in one case, we own a property that includes a portion of a vernal pool. But that vernal pool is also on several residential homes nearby. And I didn't hesitate at all to certify that pool. It in a sense informs the landowners that there's important habitat behind their house. And in addition, it really gives that wetland the protections that every other wetland has in Massachusetts, except these small vernal pool type habitats. So the good thing too about, I guess, our model for this initiative is that we're recruiting partner organizations that might have their own perspective on what to do in those kind of trickier situations. And so they will help them learn as much about this process as possible. And then they can make these decisions about which specific pools to target for certification.
We have a question is there, what is the protection of a vernal pool in terms of its size?
So right, there are, frankly, I'm wrapping my head around all the legal language surrounding the Wetlands Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. But my understanding is that a vernal pool or a wetland that holds less than 1/4 acre-feet of water to a depth of 6 inches is not protected under the Wetlands Protection Act. So for this purposes of our analyses, which are much more extensive than what I presented to you today, we used a cutoff of about 1/2 acre. We estimated that wetland habitats less than 1/2 acre are essentially not protected unless they're certified as vernal pools. So the smaller the wetland, the smaller wetlands are the ones we want to target because they're less likely to have existing protections under the Wetlands Protection Act.
That's great. Thank you, Dave. So somebody's asking about to talk a little bit more about the Cape Cod chronology maps and how to use. And as I just indicated, we've been training some of our volunteers to use Mass Mapper, and as well as the chronology. What is it? The Cape Cod chronology thing. So I think that's a great one for us to do a whole morning on, because there's so much. You could go down a rabbit hole here. There's so many layers. The Cape Cod chronology is you want to explain a little bit about how the photos were collected, Dave?
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't exactly remember. I'm not an expert in this viewer, but I'll say that this tool is extremely easy to use. It's essentially like Google Maps. You can Google Cape Cod chronology viewer, open up this tool, screenshots on the screen now, and then you can select geo-referenced aerial photographs through time, dating back to 1939. So I believe there are photos from 1939 for the entire Cape, as well as photos kind of on decadal timescales since then. So if you're interested in what things look like back in 1939 and how they've changed since then, it's just so much fun and enlightening to kind of cycle through the different aerial photographs.
Yeah, it's great down here in Chatham, you know, just to see the change in the geography of Morris Island and Monomoy is just fascinating to watch it over time. So it's a great rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, you can waste a ton of time.
Yes, and same thing on the Mass Mapper. Any other questions? This, as I said, we have recorded this. It will be available in a week or two up on our website to share with others. And I do encourage you, along with Dave, to get involved if you aren't already. And thank you so much, Dave. This has been great, and we look forward to partnering with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Lauren. Thanks for everyone who attended today. We hope to hear from you.
All right. We'll see you soon. Take care, everyone. Have a great Saturday. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lauren.
Have a great day.
All right, you too.
Bye.